Elijah stood in the cramped, dimly lit studio, paint splattered on his worn jeans and calloused hands. The faint hum of traffic from the street below filtered through the window, but the sound seemed distant, like a life he could never fully be part of. He had been working tirelessly for days on a new piece, his mind consumed with every brushstroke, every detail. The art was raw, intense, reflective of everything he felt. Yet, as he surveyed the canvas, he couldn't shake the feeling that the world outside wouldn't care. Elijah had always known his art was special, but that didn't mean it was appreciated. In fact, quite the opposite. The art world had been a maze of closed doors and narrow-minded critics who refused to see the depth of his work. Despite his undeniable talent, he was still a stranger to success, existing only on the fringes of an industry that thrived on exclusivity. The white walls of the gallery where he once dreamed of showcasing his pieces now felt like a distant fantasy. That particular gallery, the revered gallery, was known for showcasing only the best, the established names, the artists with pedigrees, the ones who could afford to network with the elite. For Elijah, it seemed like an unreachable fortress. But that day, he had finally mustered the courage to try. After weeks of anticipation and preparation, he was walking into the very gallery that had eluded him for years. His portfolio in hand, his heart racing in his chest, he stepped through the grand entrance of the revered gallery, a space adorned with towering white columns and minimalist displays. It was everything Elijah had imagined it would be: elegant, pristine, and undeniably out of his league. The receptionist barely glanced up as he approached the front desk, his breath quickening. He had rehearsed his pitch 1,000 times in his mind, but now it felt like an endless void, swallowing his thoughts whole. "I'd like to speak with the gallery owner, Mr. Marcus Revere," Elijah said, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness. The receptionist gave him a cold, disinterested nod and made a quick call. Moments later, a tall, sharply dressed man appeared, his presence commanding the room. He was the epitome of the wealthy art world, a mix of arrogance and sophistication. This was Marcus Revere, the man who had the power to either make or break an artist's career. "Well, what do we have here?" Marcus said, eyeing Elijah with the slightest smirk. He took in Elijah's worn clothes, his unkempt hair, and the portfolio under his arm, and for a brief moment, it was clear what he was thinking. The look of skepticism was unmistakable. "You want to show your work here?" Elijah nodded, his throat dry. "Yes, sir. I believe my art is a reflection of a truth that's often overlooked." Marcus raised a hand, cutting him off. "Let's see it, then," he said, his tone bordering on dismissive. With trembling hands, Elijah opened the portfolio, revealing the carefully mounted pieces within. His latest work, a series of abstract portraits, each depicting the raw emotions of Black identity, was displayed for the first time outside of his studio. He had poured every ounce of his being into this series, hoping it would speak for itself. The deep, vibrant colors bled into each other, creating a sense of urgency and power, the expressions on the painted faces raw with intensity. Marcus scanned the first piece, a raised eyebrow his only response. He flipped through the pages quickly, barely pausing to take in the complexity of the brushstrokes and the emotions conveyed through the art. "Well, these are interesting," Marcus said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But I'm afraid I don't see much value here. These aren't the kind of pieces we showcase at the Revere Gallery. You see, we deal with more established artists, people who have something substantial behind their work." Elijah felt his stomach churn. He had heard this before. He had always been told his art was too raw, too unrefined, too unconventional. But this time it hurt more than usual. He had hoped, naively, perhaps, that Marcus would see the beauty and the truth in his work. Instead, Marcus's dismissive tone made it clear that Elijah was just another unknown artist in the vast sea of hopefuls. "This isn't the right place for you, son," Marcus continued, flicking through the portfolio as if he were browsing through junk mail. "But don't get discouraged. There are plenty of smaller galleries that might appreciate this style." He gave a thin, patronizing smile. "Best of luck." Elijah's heart sank as he packed his portfolio away. The weight of rejection pressed down on him like a vice. He had never been naive enough to think success would come easily, but this was something different. This wasn't just rejection, this was a judgment of his worth, an insult to the art he poured his soul into. As he walked out of the gallery, his mind raced. He had expected rejection, but not in this way. Not so casually. The world had a way of dismissing people like him, people whose art didn't fit into the neat little boxes of mainstream culture. It was all too familiar, being ignored, being overlooked, being underestimated. Standing outside the gallery, Elijah clenched his fists, feeling the familiar anger rise within him. He had been angry at the world before, but this time it was different. This time, the anger didn't just fuel his frustration, it sparked something deeper, something that he couldn't ignore. He had spent so many years trying to fit into a world that didn't want him. Trying to prove that his art mattered. But now, something inside of him had changed. Maybe it was time to stop begging for recognition and start demanding it. The world could mock him all it wanted, but Elijah knew one thing, he wasn't going to stop. As he walked away from the Revere Gallery, a new resolve burned within him. He wouldn't let them tell him he wasn't worthy. The world would soon see that his art was worth more than they could ever understand. When the world underestimated him, it would soon learn the price of that mistake. In that moment, Elijah realized that he had reached his breaking point. And just like humanity in the darkest times, when they reached their breaking point, no one, no species, no institution, could survive the chaos he was about to unleash. Elijah's journey was just beginning, and the world would be forced to recognize him, whether they were ready for it or not. Elijah's frustration simmered for weeks after his disastrous visit to the Revere Gallery. He had thrown himself into his work more intensely than ever, each brushstroke infused with a mixture of defiance and determination. Every rejection, every sneer, had ignited a fire in him that he couldn't extinguish. He realized that he had been playing the game by their rules, and it was time for a change. It wasn't enough to prove his worth to them, he had to prove his worth to himself, to the world, and to the very system that had continuously overlooked him. The breakthrough came one afternoon when Elijah was in his studio, feverishly working on his latest piece. The phone on his desk buzzed with a notification. He didn't bother looking at it at first, focused instead on the strokes of gold and black that were bleeding into the canvas. The message pinged again. He glanced at the phone and froze. An unknown number had left a message. "Hello, Mr. Elijah Carter, my name is Richard Matthews. I am a private art collector, based in New York. I came across your work through an auction and I must say, I am thoroughly impressed. I would love to discuss the possibility of purchasing some of your pieces for my collection. I am prepared to offer a substantial sum for your art." Elijah blinked in disbelief. He read the message again to make sure he hadn't misread it. A collector? A wealthy collector? Someone was willing to pay substantial amounts for his work? He had sold some pieces before, but nothing close to what Richard Matthews was offering. This was a game changer. With his heart pounding, Elijah quickly replied, agreeing to meet Richard. He knew his art had value, but this offer, this serious, high-stakes offer, was unlike anything he had ever dreamed of. The meeting took place at a high-end art dealership in the heart of Manhattan. Elijah's nerves were a storm, but the more he saw of Richard Matthews, the more he realized that this collector was no mere passerby. Richard was dressed in a tailored suit, exuding a quiet power and confidence. His sharp eyes reflected an appreciation for the finer things, and it was clear that he understood art in a way that most others didn't. Richard led Elijah into a private room where pieces from his vast collection were displayed. The walls were lined with artwork from renowned artists, names that had long been established in the art world. But what caught Elijah's attention was the small section at the far end of the room. There, on the wall, were 3 of his pieces, ones that had been purchased by Richard from the recent auction. The paintings were framed elegantly, hanging as if they were just as valuable as the masterpieces surrounding them. Richard smiled as he saw Elijah's reaction. "I have an eye for great art, Mr. Carter. And your work, it speaks to me in a way that few pieces do. There's power in it. raw emotion. Truth. These are the kind of pieces I've been looking for. Elijah stood frozen, his mind racing. For the first time in years, he was being taken seriously. For the first time, his art wasn't just being judged, it was being revered. "I'd like to buy more of your work, Elijah," Richard continued, his tone serious. "I've been following your career, and I see potential. A lot of potential. I'm prepared to offer you a price that reflects that, millions, if you're willing to work with me exclusively." Elijah's jaw nearly hit the floor. Millions? This was no small offer. This was his big break. This was validation in a world that had long dismissed him. I'm honored," Elijah stammered, still grappling with the weight of the offer. "I didn't think anyone would see the value in what I do. But I'm ready." The deal was made. Richard Matthews became Elijah's exclusive collector, purchasing several of his most powerful works and securing future commissions. Elijah signed the contract with a sense of triumph he had never experienced before. His art, which had once been mocked and dismissed, was now worth millions. But little did Elijah know, this success was about to stir a chain of events that would shake the art world to its core. The news of his newfound success spread like wildfire. Major art publications began writing about the artist they had once ignored. His pieces were now coveted by collectors and museums around the world. There was a palpable buzz surrounding Elijah Carter's name, a buzz that could no longer be ignored. He had achieved what so many others had doubted. He had proven himself. But this was only the beginning. As Elijah reveled in his newfound success, he couldn't shake the image of the revered gallery in his mind. The memory of Marcus's smug dismissal lingered like a bad taste in his mouth. Marcus had been one of the people who had refused to see his worth. Now, the thought of that man, who had so casually discarded him, made Elijah's blood boil. The art world had underestimated him, and now they would be forced to reckon with the consequences. As the days passed, Elijah's work began to dominate auction houses and exhibitions. His name was everywhere, and his pieces were selling for astronomical sums. The question on everyone's mind was, how had they missed such an obvious talent? And then, just when the momentum seemed unstoppable, a story broke that sent shockwaves through the industry. Elijah Carter, the artist the world had overlooked, now commanding millions for his art, had sold his pieces to a private collector, the same man who had purchased works from other well-known artists at astronomical prices. The public's hunger for information about the mysterious artist grew insatiable. Who was Elijah Carter? How had he gone from a nobody to one of the most sought-after artists in the world? At the same time, Marcus Revere was left seething in the aftermath of his ill-fated dismissal of Elijah. The truth was undeniable, he had missed the chance to represent one of the most significant artists of his time. His arrogance had led to a massive oversight, one that now threatened to unravel everything he had worked for. His gallery, once a beacon of exclusivity, now looked like a relic of a bygone era, outdated and irrelevant in the face of Elijah's meteoric rise. And so, as Elijah's reputation soared, Marcus's gallery began to falter. Exhibitions that had once drawn crowds now saw fewer and fewer visitors. The names Marcus had championed were now forgotten as the world's attention turned to the young artist who had been written off as nothing more than a passing trend. For Marcus, it felt like a personal betrayal. He couldn't comprehend how he had failed to see what was right in front of him. The realization stung, cutting deeper than he could have imagined. As the gap between his own gallery's success and Elijah's grew wider, Marcus's desperation only deepened. The art world had reached a turning point. The old guard was being replaced by new voices, voices that had been silenced for far too long. And Elijah, with his bold, unapologetic art, was leading the charge. When humans reach their breaking point, they become forces of nature, unstoppable and relentless. Elijah had reached his, and now, like a storm on the horizon, no one could survive the chaos that was about to ensue. Elijah's transformation from a struggling artist to a name synonymous with success and rebellion was nothing short of meteoric. The world, once indifferent, had finally begun to take notice, and with that came the validation he had always known he deserved. His work was no longer confined to his small, cluttered studio, it was now on the walls of prestigious galleries, in the hands of wealthy collectors, and being spoken about in the same breath as some of the world's most celebrated artists. His first major exhibition, hosted by Richard Matthews, was a turning point. It sold out within hours, and the pieces, many of which had never been seen by the public before, fetched prices that were unfathomable just months ago. His art, raw and powerful in its portrayal of Black identity, resonated with people on a deeply emotional level. They saw in his paintings not just color and form, but the struggles, triumphs, and untold stories of a people who had been silenced for centuries. The art world, which had previously dismissed him as too raw, too political, and too unconventional, now had no choice but to reckon with him. Museums began to seek his work for their collections, and auction houses were eager to feature his pieces. The demand was overwhelming, and Elijah found himself at the center of an artistic revolution. His art was no longer just something that existed in a small corner of the world, it was a symbol, a movement, a statement that demanded attention. But as the offers and recognition poured in, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He had proved himself as an artist, but the weight of success was starting to feel heavier than he had expected. The fame, the money, it was all so new, so foreign, and yet he had earned every bit of it. What bothered him more, however, was the realization that the people who had once mocked him, the art critics, the gallery owners, were now falling over themselves to be associated with his name. There was one person in particular who had made Elijah's journey especially bitter, Marcus Revere. The man who had so callously dismissed him in the beginning was now a distant memory, but the sting of that rejection still lingered. It wasn't just the rejection itself that hurt, it was the reminder that those in power had the ability to control the trajectory of an artist's life. Marcus had been too blind, too consumed with his own sense of superiority, to recognize Elijah's potential. But Elijah wasn't one to forget. As his art continued to climb in value, he couldn't help but think of how Marcus would react when he saw what Elijah had achieved. One afternoon, while in his studio, Elijah received a call that would change everything. It was from his agent, who sounded unusually urgent. "Elijah, you need to hear this," his agent said, his voice crackling with excitement. "There's a major bidding war going on for your work. We're talking millions, I'm talking about pieces being auctioned for prices we never thought possible." Elijah's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment he had dreamed about. The moment when his work would finally reach its true worth. "But there's more," his agent continued. "There's a rumor circulating that Marcus Revere wants to represent you. He's trying to get in on the action. He's aware of how much your art is worth now, and he's willing to offer you a partnership. He wants to be part of your journey, wants to take you under his wing." Elijah's blood ran cold. Marcus? After everything that had happened, after the way he had humiliated him? Elijah had worked hard to distance himself from people like Marcus, people who saw art as a commodity rather than a reflection of life itself. "I'm not interested," Elijah said firmly. "Tell him I'm done with people like him. I'll make my own way." But even as he spoke the words, a thought lingered in his mind. Was this the ultimate revenge? Was it enough to simply succeed, or did he need to make Marcus beg for forgiveness? The temptation to see Marcus grovel was strong, but Elijah knew he had already won. He didn't need Marcus. He had built his own empire. Still, the offer was tempting. What if Elijah used this as an opportunity to teach Marcus a lesson he would never forget? The thought of rubbing his success in Marcus's face filled him with a certain sense of satisfaction. But the more Elijah thought about it, the more he realized something important. Marcus was part of an old guard. An old system that would never understand the value of his work. They could try to buy in, to profit from his success, but they would always be beneath him. Elijah didn't need their validation. He had already proven everything. He thought back to his humble beginnings, when he had painted in the dim light of his studio, hoping for recognition, hoping for the world to understand. Now, the world was forced to reckon with him. The validation he had once craved was no longer necessary. The art world, with all its pretensions and power struggles, had been forced to acknowledge what it had so long ignored, that real art, art that comes from the soul, could not be confined to any one person's definition. Elijah's work was more than just paint on canvas. It was an embodiment of resilience. It was a declaration of his existence in a world that had tried to silence him. And now, people were listening. They had no choice. But as Elijah basked in his success, he couldn't ignore the change that was sweeping through the art world. The rules were shifting. The old power structures were crumbling. No longer could galleries like the Revere Gallery hold the keys to success. No longer could the critics dictate what was worthy. Elijah's rise was a symptom of a larger shift in the world, a world that was starting to demand diversity, starting to demand authenticity. As his art sold for millions, as his name became a household one, Elijah's thoughts turned inward. He could feel the weight of the power he now wielded. He wasn't just a successful artist. He was a force in the art world, and he knew it. With power came responsibility. He didn't want to simply take his place in the system, he wanted to change it. And as he walked into his next exhibition, where his latest collection was displayed in front of thousands, he realized the full extent of what he had accomplished. He had forced the world to reckon with him. But the most powerful realization of all was that, in doing so, he had also forced the world to reckon with itself. Elijah had not just risen above the critics, the dismissive gallery owners, and the condescending art establishment. He had created something that transcended their shallow judgments. He had shown the world that when humans reach their breaking point, when they rise from the ashes of rejection and oppression, they become an unstoppable force. And no one, not Marcus, not the critics, not anyone, could survive the chaos he was about to unleash on the art world. Elijah's name had become synonymous with revolution. His art was no longer just an expression of individual emotion, it had grown into a symbol of resistance, strength, and the untold stories of those who had long been silenced. With each new painting, each new auction, he dismantled the boundaries of the art world that had once excluded him. His work now commanded respect, not just in the circles of the rich and elite, but among those who saw art as a reflection of their own struggles. His art was a mirror to the world's inequities, and people couldn't look away. But as his fame grew, so did the pressure. Elijah was no longer just an artist, he was a symbol. And symbols were always at risk of being co-opted, diluted, or destroyed. There were whispers behind closed doors about his sudden rise, questions about his authenticity, and attempts to reduce his work to mere trend. Some even labeled him a protest artist, as if his entire career could be contained by a single, politically charged label. Elijah knew that these labels were dangerous, they minimized the power of his message. His art was more than just a reaction, it was a reflection of a lived experience, an ongoing story of resilience and defiance. Yet, the more successful he became, the more the world seemed to try to box him into something he wasn't. Marcus Revere, watching from the sidelines, was still fuming. He couldn't believe how the tables had turned. His gallery, once revered as a temple of high art, was losing its grip on the market. He had seen the shift coming but never anticipated it would happen so fast, nor that it would be led by someone like Elijah. The audacity of it all, the sheer brilliance, was maddening to him. He began to obsess over Elijah's rise, replaying their first meeting in his mind over and over again. Elijah had stood there in his gallery, trying to impress him with his art, but Marcus had dismissed him as just another struggling artist. He had never even considered that Elijah might one day surpass him in every way. But now, as he watched his own reputation crumble, the bitterness grew. Marcus's gallery had once been a haven for collectors and investors looking for the next big name. Now, it was a joke. They had been too slow to recognize the importance of Elijah's work, and they had missed out on a fortune. He had seen the bidding wars for Elijah's pieces, the astronomical sums that were being paid for works that, only a year ago, he had scoffed at. It had become clear that Elijah was no longer just an artist. He was a movement. The whispers about Elijah, the attempts to label him, to diminish his importance, they all seemed to stem from this one undeniable truth: Elijah's art was shaking the very foundation of the establishment. The traditional gallery owners, collectors, and critics who had once held all the power in the art world now found themselves struggling to keep up. They couldn't ignore him any longer, but they certainly didn't know how to control him. For someone like Marcus, that was a terrifying prospect. Determined to reclaim some sense of control, Marcus hatched a plan. If he couldn't stop Elijah from rising, he would do the next best thing: he would co-opt the very movement Elijah had created. He knew that to truly capture the attention of the art world once again, he needed to align himself with Elijah. But he also knew that Elijah wasn't just some artist to be managed or controlled. He had made it clear that he was more than just a product to be sold. Marcus was going to have to appeal to Elijah's ego, his sense of justice, and convince him that they could both benefit from working together. Marcus set up a meeting with Elijah, using all the charm he could muster. When they met at a cafe in the heart of Manhattan, Marcus was as polished and persuasive as ever. "Elijah, my friend," Marcus began, his voice smooth. "I've been following your career closely. You've done something remarkable. Truly remarkable. I want to help you take it to the next level. I'm willing to offer you a partnership, exclusive representation. The kind of exposure you deserve. We can put your art in front of the right people, at the right time. I can take you to a level you can't even imagine." Elijah sat across from Marcus, his arms crossed, eyes narrowed. He had heard this speech before. It was the same one Marcus had used on countless artists. He had tried to play the same game, but Elijah had outgrown it. He had already moved beyond Marcus's type of thinking. Yet, a part of him couldn't help but be intrigued. The temptation of even greater recognition, of further validation from the very system that had once rejected him, was difficult to ignore. "You're late, Marcus," Elijah said coldly, his voice steady but full of disdain. "I've already surpassed your system. I'm done with people like you." Marcus's expression faltered for just a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "You're an artist, Elijah. You want the exposure, the legacy. I can give you that. This isn't about systems. This is about making history." But Elijah was resolute. He had reached the point where he no longer needed to play by anyone else's rules. He didn't need Marcus to validate his success. He had already done the impossible by creating a space for himself in an art world that had once excluded him. "You've missed your chance, Marcus," Elijah said. "You had me when I was nothing. Now, I'm everything. You can't control what I become. You don't get to take credit for my success." The words stung, and Marcus's face reddened with frustration. He had never been denied in this way before. Artists were supposed to want his approval. They were supposed to beg for his endorsement. But Elijah wasn't like the others. He was a force unto himself. The two men sat in silence for a moment, the tension thick between them. Marcus could feel the shifting tides of the art world crashing against him. His gallery, his influence, everything he had built, he could feel it slipping away. But the truth was, he wasn't just losing to Elijah. He was losing to something much larger, a cultural shift that was finally giving a platform to voices that had long been silenced. "I guess I was wrong about you, Elijah," Marcus said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not too late to come back. You can still be part of this world." Elijah shook his head. "You're wrong about one thing, Marcus. I am part of this world. But not in the way you think." With that, Elijah stood up and walked away, leaving Marcus to stew in his own arrogance. As he exited the cafe, the streets of New York seemed to stretch out before him, full of promise. He didn't need Marcus. He didn't need anyone. The world was his now. The art world, for all its history and tradition, had been thrown into chaos. Elijah had cracked it wide open. And as the dust settled, one thing was clear: when humans reach their breaking point, when they rise against the injustices that have held them down for so long, there's no power in the world that can contain their fury. No gallery, no critic, no system can survive the chaos. Elijah had not only shattered the old guard, he had redefined the very idea of what it meant to be an artist. And there was no turning back. Elijah's success in the art world had gone beyond even his own expectations. His exhibitions were now global events. From London to Tokyo, his work was being displayed in the most prestigious galleries, and his pieces were featured in elite auctions where they were fetching millions. He had made a name for himself as an artist who represented not just skill and creativity, but a revolutionary voice that spoke to the struggles of marginalized communities. What had once been dismissed as raw or political art was now celebrated as groundbreaking, and his influence had spread far beyond the art world itself. His life had become a whirlwind of press conferences, private viewings, and international travel. Yet, amid the dizzying pace of his new world, Elijah remained deeply rooted in the purpose that had driven him in the first place, to share stories that had never been told, to challenge the systems that sought to oppress, and to create art that spoke to the human condition in its most honest and unflinching form. He had begun to see his work not just as a personal triumph, but as a tool for social change. But with that power came complications. Elijah had risen to the top of the art world, but the world had changed in ways that he hadn't fully anticipated. What had once been a personal mission of self-expression had now become a business, one that demanded constant attention, negotiations, and compromises. His success was beginning to pull him in multiple directions. While he still poured his heart into his work, the pressure to keep up with demand, to continue to push the boundaries of his art while meeting the expectations of a now global audience, was becoming overwhelming. His agent, Matt, who had once been a voice of guidance, now seemed more like a business manager, constantly advising him on which collectors to align with, which galleries to trust, and which events to attend. The art world was rife with politics, and Elijah found himself navigating a labyrinth of backroom deals, sponsorships, and endless invitations to collaborate with corporations that saw his art as a marketing tool more than a form of self-expression. It was a far cry from the days when he had simply painted for himself, when the only measure of success was the feeling of his brush on canvas. One evening, after a particularly grueling press event in Paris, Elijah found himself standing on the balcony of his luxurious penthouse overlooking the city. The lights of the city twinkled below him, but he felt no peace. He had everything he had ever dreamed of: fame, fortune, recognition, but something was missing. The raw passion that had driven him to create, that had once fueled his defiance, now seemed clouded by the weight of expectations. He took a long, slow breath, watching the bustling streets below. In the distance, the Eiffel Tower loomed, its silhouette casting a shadow over the city. Everything in his life had changed, but in a way, he hadn't. He was still the same man who had fought against rejection, against being silenced. He had achieved everything he set out to do, but now he was part of the very system he had once fought against. "I've got to find a way to control this," he murmured to himself, frustration creeping into his voice. He knew that his art was still revolutionary, still carrying the weight of his message. But the world he had entered was beginning to consume him. He was no longer just Elijah, the artist, he was now Elijah, the brand. He had been thrust into the spotlight, and every move he made was scrutinized. It was no longer enough to create for himself, he had to create for the world. As the months passed, Elijah began to retreat from the public eye. He stopped attending high-profile events and started turning down offers to work with major corporations. He no longer wanted to be the face of a movement that was so easily co-opted by the establishment. He had spent years fighting for a voice, but now he realized that he was being swallowed whole by the very thing he had fought against: commodification. His art had become a product, and he was no longer sure if he controlled it or if it controlled him. He started spending more time in his studio, isolated from the world. It was there, in the quiet solitude of his work, that he began to rediscover the passion he had once had for creating. He had long ago stopped painting for the approval of others. Now, he painted for himself, seeking the same release and catharsis that he had when he first picked up a brush. Each canvas became a journey of self-discovery, a way to reconnect with the truth he had almost lost in the whirlwind of fame. But the outside world didn't let go so easily. The media continued to bombard him with questions, trying to pull him back into the chaos of celebrity. They wanted to know why he wasn't attending this gallery or that auction. They speculated about his next big move, wondering if his influence was waning. Some whispered that his art had grown stale, that his message had become diluted. The critics, who had once been silent in the face of his genius, were now vocal in their attempts to categorize him, to place him in a box where they could control his narrative. One day, Elijah received an unexpected visitor. It was Marcus Revere, the man who had once mocked him, the man who had dismissed him as unworthy. He had seen the cracks in Elijah's empire, the signs of a disillusioned artist who had lost his way. Marcus knew that now was his chance. He had come to make one last offer, to convince Elijah to return to the fold. "Elijah, I've been watching you," Marcus said, standing in the doorway of the studio. "I know you're struggling. You've built something incredible, but you're about to lose it all if you don't come back. You need me. I can guide you through this. We can make you even bigger than you already are. Together, we can control the narrative. You can be more than just an artist, you can be a legend." Elijah looked at Marcus for a long time, considering his words. His mind raced with memories of their past encounters, of how Marcus had once belittled him, dismissed him as nothing more than a passing trend. And yet, here Marcus was, trying to latch onto his success like a parasite, desperate to take credit for the art that Elijah had created through his own blood, sweat, and tears. "I'm not interested in your offers, Marcus," Elijah replied calmly, his voice steady. "I built my legacy without you, and I'll continue to do so. You might have helped create this system, but I'm breaking it down. I don't need anyone to tell my story anymore." Marcus's face fell, but he quickly recovered, his expression hardening. "You'll regret this, Elijah. You can't escape the system forever. No one can." As Marcus walked out, the door shutting behind him with a soft thud, Elijah finally felt a sense of clarity. He didn't need Marcus. He didn't need anyone. The empire he had built, the legacy he had created, it was his, and his alone. It wasn't about fame or fortune anymore. It was about creating something real, something that spoke to the truth of who he was and what he believed. Elijah's art, once a personal journey of self-expression, had now become a legacy that transcended time. The world might try to co-opt it, but it could never truly control it. His rise had shaken the art world to its core, and in doing so, he had shown the world that when humans reach their breaking point, when they rise against systems that seek to control them, they become unstoppable. And no one could survive the chaos he was creating, not even the very forces that had once tried to silence him. The world had shifted beneath Elijah's feet, and now he was standing at the epicenter of that revolution. The walls of galleries and auction houses that had once kept him out now echoed with his name. His work had become synonymous with resistance, an emblem of the fight against a system that sought to commodify not just art, but identity itself. He had succeeded in shattering the boundaries of the art world, but in doing so, he had also come face to face with the very forces that had once rejected him. Despite the success, Elijah was exhausted. The constant pressure to stay relevant, to push boundaries, to appease collectors and critics, it was all beginning to wear him down. He could feel the cracks in his resolve, the way the world's expectations seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. The fight for authenticity had started to feel like a battle against a machine that would never stop grinding, no matter how much he resisted. It wasn't just the art world that was changing. The world outside the galleries and auction rooms was undergoing its own transformation. Movements for justice were growing stronger, pushing against the structures that had long upheld inequality. People were rising up against the systems of power that had oppressed them for centuries. Elijah's art had become an emblem of this fight, a visual manifestation of a world that was no longer willing to accept the status quo. But with that recognition came a new challenge. The more Elijah's message resonated, the more dangerous it became. His work was no longer just art, it was a symbol, a rallying cry. And symbols had a way of attracting both admiration and retaliation. It wasn't long before Elijah found himself under attack from those who saw his art as a threat. The first signs of this shift came during an exhibition in Berlin. Elijah's latest collection had been displayed in a prestigious gallery, and it was receiving rave reviews. Critics were lauding his ability to capture the struggles of marginalized communities with such depth and complexity. But as the opening night drew to a close, Elijah began to notice something unsettling. A group of men, well-dressed and clearly out of place, had been lurking in the shadows of the gallery, watching him intently. Their expressions were hard to read, but the coldness in their eyes made him uneasy. By the time the night ended, the incident had escalated. A threatening message had been left for Elijah, an anonymous note slipped under the door of his hotel room, reading simply, "You can't escape the truth forever." The threat was subtle, but the meaning was clear. Someone, or something, was trying to silence him. Elijah had long known that his rise to prominence would stir the pot, but he hadn't expected the forces he was up against to be so direct in their opposition. The note was a warning, and it was just the beginning. Back in New York, Elijah's agent, Matt, had been fielding increasingly aggressive calls from collectors and investors. Many were concerned about the political nature of Elijah's work and the attention it was drawing from controversial groups. They wanted him to tone down the social commentary, to focus more on the art itself, rather than the message it carried. The whispers of discontent were growing louder. "Elijah, we need to talk," Matt had said one morning, his tone unusually serious. "There's pressure coming from the top. Big collectors, wealthy buyers, they're worried about the direction your art is taking. They want you to adjust, to make it less about the struggle and more about the aesthetic. This is a business, Elijah. You can't afford to alienate your patrons." Elijah had listened quietly, but inside, he felt a deep sense of anger. He had known from the beginning that the art world was a business, but he had refused to let it dictate the message of his work. He had fought too hard, come too far, to be told what he could and couldn't create. "Tell them I'm not a puppet," Elijah replied, his voice steady but firm. "If they want art without truth, they can find it somewhere else. I'm not compromising." Matt had sighed, clearly frustrated, but said nothing more. He knew Elijah's determination. Still, the stakes were higher than they had ever been. The art world was no longer just about making a statement, it was about survival. Elijah's survival. But the tension was growing elsewhere too. The anonymous threats, the whispers in the art community, the pressure to conform, it was all taking a toll. Elijah began to question whether the fight was worth it. He had succeeded in many ways, but the cost was mounting. The world seemed to be closing in on him from all sides, and every time he took a step forward, it felt like the universe pushed him 2 steps back. His breaking point came one evening when he sat in his studio, staring at a blank canvas. He had been trying for days to start a new piece, something that would continue the story he had been telling, something that would push his message even further. But the words, the colors, the ideas, they wouldn't come. The pressure was too great. The need to be perfect, to be revolutionary, to make an impact, it was suffocating him. As he sat there in silence, a single thought rose to the surface of his mind: is this the price of greatness? He had built an empire of art, but now he was beginning to see the cracks in its foundation. The art world, once a sanctuary for his soul, had become a battleground. The forces that had once celebrated him now sought to control him. His work, once pure and true, was now a tool in a larger game, a game that he hadn't fully understood when he first picked up his brush. The reckoning had arrived. Elijah knew that he couldn't continue down this path. He had to make a choice. Would he compromise his vision to fit into the system that had once rejected him, or would he tear it all down and walk away from everything he had built? The world was watching, waiting for him to make his move. But as the days passed, Elijah realized something. The choice wasn't between compromise and rebellion. It was about reclaiming control. He had created something powerful, something that had already shaken the foundations of the art world. But now, it was time to take that power back. He would no longer be a pawn in the game of commerce and politics. He would create for himself, for his truth, and for the people who had always believed in him. The reckoning was not just an external battle against the forces that sought to silence him. It was an internal war, a fight for his own soul. And Elijah knew that when humans reach their breaking point, when they refuse to be controlled by the systems that seek to oppress them, there is no force strong enough to stop them. No threat, no pressure, no compromise could ever take away the power of his truth. With that realization, Elijah stood up, walked to his canvas, and began to paint once more. This time, he wasn't just creating art. He was creating his own destiny. The reckoning had only just begun. The next few months were a blur of intense focus and quiet reflection. Elijah had made his choice. He would no longer bow to the expectations of the art world. Instead, he would use his work as a platform for something far more significant, a revolution of truth. No longer would he let the business of art dictate his creativity. No longer would he compromise his message for the sake of fame or fortune. He began to work on a new collection, one that would be his most personal yet. The canvases were raw, unfiltered, and powerful, reflecting his inner turmoil and his journey toward reclaiming his authenticity. He poured his heart into each piece, not for the sake of approval or recognition, but because he believed in the power of art to speak the truth, to expose the systems of oppression, to challenge the status quo, and to give voice to the voiceless. The collection, which he dubbed Revolution of Truth, was not just a series of paintings. It was a manifesto. Each piece told a story of defiance, of resilience, and of the battle against forces that sought to keep people in chains, whether those chains were political, economic, or social. Elijah had once been a product of those systems, but now he was using his art to dismantle them. As the first few pieces began to take shape, Elijah began to feel a sense of liberation he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't just about the art, it was about reclaiming his own power, his own voice. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace with his work. His creations were no longer a commodity to be bought and sold. They were weapons in a larger war, and he was ready to fight. But the world was watching, and as soon as word spread that Elijah was working on a new collection, the pressure began to mount again. The galleries, the collectors, the critics, they were all waiting to see what he would do next. The questions that had once plagued him now seemed irrelevant. He no longer cared about the opinions of those who sought to commodify his work. He had a message, and it was more important than anything else. One afternoon, as Elijah put the finishing touches on his latest piece, his agent, Matt, called. The tone of his voice was strained, as if he were speaking to Elijah, but also to someone else. Elijah, we've got a problem, he said. The auction house has pulled out. They're not going to display your work in the upcoming gala. And the big investors, they're backing out too. They say the direction your work is taking is too political, too risky. Elijah didn't flinch. He had known this moment would come. Tell them I'm not interested, he replied firmly. I'm not making art for them. I'm making it for the people who understand what it means to fight for their truth. They don't need to sell it. They need to see it. There was silence on the other end of the line. For a moment, Elijah thought Matt might say something to persuade him, but instead, the call ended with a quiet click. Elijah had never been one to compromise, and now, more than ever, he knew that what he was creating had the power to change the world. He would not let anyone take that away from him. As he continued working on his pieces, the world outside his studio began to react. The media took notice of the shift in Elijah's work, and the reactions were mixed. Some hailed his bravery, his willingness to speak out against the forces that had long controlled art and culture. Others, especially the powerful elites who had once sought to profit from his work, reacted with disdain. They saw Elijah's new direction as a threat, an attack on the very systems that had made him successful. But Elijah wasn't concerned with their reactions. He was focused on something greater. As he worked, he thought back to the countless artists, writers, musicians, and activists who had used their craft to challenge the status quo, to speak out against injustice. He thought about those who had been silenced, who had been erased from history. He thought about the young artists, just like him, who were struggling to find their voices in a world that wanted to silence them. They were the ones he was creating for. They were the ones who would carry his message forward. When the collection was finally complete, Elijah knew he had created something monumental. It wasn't just art, it was a revolution. And it was time to share it with the world. He decided to host a private exhibition, not in a gallery, but in a warehouse, a raw, unpolished space where the art could speak for itself, without the confines of high society's expectations. He invited those who truly understood the meaning of his work, young artists, activists, and members of the marginalized communities that had inspired him. There were no press, no cameras, just people who cared about the message, who believed in the power of art to create change. The night of the exhibition, the room was filled with energy and anticipation. As people stood before the paintings, their faces lit up with recognition and understanding. Each piece was a reflection of their own struggles, their own fight for justice and truth. Elijah's work had become a mirror for those who had long been ignored, a space where their stories could finally be told. As the night went on, Elijah stood quietly in the corner, watching as people interacted with his work. For the first time in a long while, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what it was all about, not the fame, not the money, but the impact. His work was speaking to people in a way that he had always hoped it would. It was stirring something deep within them, something that had been dormant for too long. As the exhibition came to a close, Elijah stepped up to the front of the room. He had never been one to give speeches, but tonight felt different. He had a message that needed to be heard. "I've spent my whole life fighting for my place in the art world," he said, his voice steady and clear. "But I've come to realize that the art world doesn't need me. It's the people who need us, the artists, the rebels, the truth-tellers. We are the ones who have the power to change the world, to shake the foundations of everything that's wrong with this system. Our voices can't be silenced. Our art can't be controlled. And together, we'll create a future where truth, not profit, guides the way." The room erupted in applause. Elijah's words were met with cheers, with shouts of support, with tears of joy. It was a moment of unity, of solidarity, of understanding. And in that moment, Elijah knew that he had won. He had reclaimed his art, his voice, and his power. The revolution had begun, and it was unstoppable. Elijah had come full circle. He had risen from being a dismissed artist, mocked and rejected, to becoming a force that no one could ignore. His work, once a symbol of resistance, had now become a beacon of hope. And as long as humans reached their breaking point and refused to be silenced, there would always be room for the chaos of truth. And no one, not the art world, not the critics, not the collectors, could ever control that. The revolution of truth was just beginning. And Elijah was at the heart